The velvet ribbon on the gift box felt like a fuse, and I was the one holding the match. I had exactly 30 seconds to deliver a box that was supposed to end Ulrich Vaughn's life, or use it to save his soul. My fingers fumbled against the black cardboard, my breath hitching as I tucked the rewritten note beneath the lid, the ink still wet, a desperate plea masquerading as a delivery. The small black box felt heavier than the 50-pound crates I usually hauled for Quick Drop. It felt like it held the weight of an entire empire. Inside the Diamond Heights penthouse, the air was thick with the scent of expensive oud and cold, calculated ambition. Crystal chandeliers cast jagged shadows against the mahogany walls, and the muffled sound of a cello quartet hummed with the low frequency of untouchable wealth. Outside, the city of Seoul was a sprawling grid of neon and ice, but in here, the silence was suffocating. I approached the VIP lounge like I was walking toward my own execution. Ulrich Vaughn sat at the head of the obsidian table, his back to the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glittering behind him like a throne of stolen lights. He looked like he'd been forged in a furnace, sharp jawline, slicked-back hair, and a Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than my community center's entire mortgage. His hand rested on the table, fingers drumming a slow, predatory rhythm that matched the hammering of my heart. Beside him, Neria Vale leaned in close, her red lips curving into a smile as she whispered into his ear. Her diamond earrings caught the light, throwing fractured rainbows across the table, making her look like a woman deeply in love. She wasn't. 15 minutes ago, I hadn't been a savior. I'd just been a delivery girl looking for a signature. I'd been standing in the service hallway when I heard her voice, sharp, cold, and stripped of the sweetness she used on Ulrich. She was speaking into a burner phone, her words a jagged mix of English and a dialect I barely recognized. He's at the table. The glass is the kill zone. The gift is the signal. When he opens it, you take the shot. I should have run. I should have dropped the box and disappeared into the Seoul night. Instead, I stood there, my hand still on the service door handle, watching through the crack as she hung up and checked her reflection in a compact mirror, her expression as smooth and hard as marble. The Quick Drop package in my hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. I stood rooted to the spot, my Quick Drop cap pulled low, feeling the sweat prickle against the back of my neck. Ulrich Vaughn didn't look at me. Men like him were trained to see through people like me, treating service staff as part of the architecture. He remained a statue of marble and ink, his fingers continuing that slow, predatory rhythm against the obsidian tabletop. There was a profound, chilling silence surrounding him, a vacuum of isolation that seemed to swallow the ambient noise of the cello quartet. He was the most powerful man in the room, yet he sat in a cage of his own making, blinded by the very pride that had built his throne. Beside him, Neria Vale was the picture of effortless elegance, but up close, the fractured rainbows from her diamond earrings looked like shards of ice. She wasn't looking at the man she was supposed to marry. Instead, she was focused on the glow of her phone, her thumb gliding over the screen with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. Every few seconds, a soft chime signaled a message, and that was when I saw it. The smirk. It was a small, sharp upturn of her red lips, a flicker of dark satisfaction that didn't reach her eyes. It was the expression of a gambler who knew the deck was stacked, the silent gloating of a Judas who had already counted her silver. She leaned in toward Ulrich, the scent of her expensive perfume clashing with the metallic tang of fear rising in my throat, and whispered something meant to look like an endearment. Ulrich merely nodded, his gaze fixed forward on nothing, completely unaware that the woman leaning against his shoulder had already mapped out the trajectory of the bullets meant for his chest. The contrast was nauseating. Here was a man so feared that the city trembled at his name, yet he was utterly defenseless against the betrayal sitting right next to him. He was a king in checkmate who hadn't realized the game was over. I shifted the small black box in my hands, the velvet ribbon catching the light. Neria's eyes finally flicked toward me, her smirk widening just a fraction, a silent command to finish the delivery that would trigger his end. She thought she was the one in control, the architect of a masterpiece of malice. She had no idea that a delivery girl with a smudged note and a shaking hand was about to disrupt her perfect, lethal design. I stepped forward, the floor beneath my sneakers feeling like thin ice. The small black box in my hands was no longer just a package. It was a physical manifestation of a choice between life and death. Neria's gaze remained fixed on her phone, her smirk a permanent, chilling fixture as she waited for the signal to be sent. Auric finally turned his head, his eyes, cold, weary, and dark as the obsidian table, settling on me with a heavy, dismissive weight. "Delivery for Mr. Vaughn," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, though the box trembled in my grip. He didn't speak. He simply reached out, his tattooed hand moving with a slow, predatory grace to take the gift. Neria finally looked up, her eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger disguised as curiosity. She was waiting for the death blow, the moment the box opened and the assassins outside saw the signal to pull the trigger. Auric pulled the velvet ribbon. The sound of the silk sliding against the cardboard felt like a scream in the silent room. He lifted the lid, his body tensing as if he expected a spring-loaded blade. But instead of the expensive watch or the laced detonator Neria had intended, Auric stared down at a small, crumpled slip of paper and a worn wooden cross, a token of faith I'd carried in my pocket since I was a child. He froze. The drumming of his fingers stopped instantly. His mouth went slightly agape, the marble-like composure of his face fracturing into something raw and unrecognizable. He didn't see the hitmen in position. He saw the words I'd scrawled in smeared wet ink. "The darkness is passing, and the true light is already shining. They are in position. Run." Beside him, Neria's smirk vanished. She leaned in, her brow furrowing as she tried to catch a glimpse of the contents, her hand reaching for her phone to send the final message. But Auric was no longer the blind king. He looked up from the note, his gaze locking onto mine. In that second, the air in the penthouse shifted. It wasn't the fear of death that held him. It was a sudden, violent conviction. The realization that an invisible girl had seen his soul and chosen to save it. The first gunshot shattered the floor-to-ceiling glass behind him, a jagged spiderweb of white appearing where his head had been a second before, but he had already begun to move. The scream of shattering glass swallowed the cello quartet's final notes, a jagged chorus of destruction that signaled the end of Ulrich Vohn's empire as he knew it. Dust and diamond-like shards of the floor-to-ceiling windows rained down on the obsidian table, but the man who had looked like marble only seconds ago was now a blur of survival. Ulrich lunged across the table, his hand still clutching my crumpled note, grabbing the collar of my quick-drop vest and pulling me down toward the floor just as a second round of suppressed fire hissed through the air where I had been standing. Neria was gone. In the chaos, she had disappeared toward the private elevators, her cold smirk replaced by the frantic movements of a predator who realized her prey had been tipped off. The penthouse, once a fortress of silent, untouchable power, had become a kill zone of golden light and lethal shadows. "The service stairs," I gasped, my chest tightening as the smell of gunpowder began to choke the air. Ulrich looked at me, his eyes wide and fractured with a shock that went deeper than the assassination attempt. He was the most feared man in the city, a high-ranking mafia figure accustomed to being the predator, yet here he was, crouched in the wreckage of his own dinner, forced to look into the eyes of a delivery girl he usually wouldn't have acknowledged. "Why?" he rasped, the word barely audible over the sound of heavy boots drumming against the hallway carpet. He wasn't asking about the hit. He was asking about the wooden cross still clutched in his palm. "Because your soul is worth more than their bullets," I whispered, grabbing his sleeve. "Now move!" I led him through the kitchen, a maze of stainless steel and panicked staff, moving with the frantic speed of someone who had spent her life navigating the city's service entrances and back alleys. Ulrich followed, his movements heavy and uncoordinated, stripped of his predatory rhythm. He was a king without a throne, stumbling through a world where his Ford suit and neck tattoos offered no protection against the men Neria had placed in position. We burst through the heavy fire doors into the concrete stairwell, the cold air of the lower levels rushing up to meet us. Every floor we descended felt like a layer of his old life being stripped away. As we reached the alleyway, the winter wind howled against the brick, a sharp contrast to the suffocating warmth of the restaurant. Ulrich leaned against a dumpster, his breath coming in ragged, uneven bursts as he stared at me, the invisible girl who had become his only lifeline. In the darkness of the alley, the power imbalance had shifted. The boss was no longer in control, and the secret savior was the only one who knew the way out. The safe house was a cramped, forgotten basement unit beneath a laundromat, smelling of industrial soap and damp concrete. Ulrich sat heavily on a plastic-covered chair, his Tom Ford suit jacket discarded on the floor, revealing a white shirt stained with a spreading bloom of crimson at the shoulder. A stray shard of glass or a grazing bullet had finally caught up to him during our flight through the frozen alleys. His breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound that echoed off the cinder block walls. But his eyes never left the small wooden cross he still gripped in his uninjured hand. I didn't approach him with the trembling hands of a victim or the cold efficiency of a soldier. Instead, I moved with the steady, quiet purpose of someone who had spent her nights cleaning the wounds of a broken neighborhood. When I knelt before him with a bowl of warm water and a first aid kit, he flinched, his muscles coiling with a reflexive, predatory instinct. "Easy," I murmured, my voice a soft anchor in the dimly lit room. "I'm just here to help." As I cut away his sleeve, the true map of his life was revealed. Not just the fresh, bleeding gash, but a tapestry of older scars that crisscrossed his skin like jagged lightning. They were marks of a life defined by blood debts and the heavy weight of an empire built on fear. My fingers were gentle as I cleaned the wound, my touch devoid of the terror he usually commanded from the world. I saw him watching me, his brow furrowed in deep, agonizing confusion. In his world, every touch had a price, and every mercy was a trap. "Why aren't you running?" he rasped, his voice sounding hollow and stripped of its authority. "You saw who I am. You saw the tattoos. You saw the men who want me dead. I am a monster to people like you." I squeezed the cloth, the pink water dripping back into the bowl. I looked up, meeting his fractured gaze with a steady, unwavering light. "I see a man who is bleeding," I said simply. I reached out, my thumb brushing near a faded scar on his forearm before I began to bandage the new injury. Most people see these marks and see a finished book. They see a predator. But I've spent my life watching people break and mend. I tightened the gauze, my eyes locking onto his. "Your scars don't have to be your story, Ulrich. They're just where you've been, not where you're going." For the first time, the Mafia boss didn't look like marble or iron. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a total inner collapse. The silence that followed wasn't the suffocating quiet of the penthouse. It was the heavy, expectant silence of a soul hearing a truth it had long ago forgotten. He looked down at his bandaged arm, then back at me, the predatory rhythm of his heart finally slowing to a human beat. The damp air of the basement safe house suddenly felt electric as Ulrich's shock began to harden into a familiar, cold resolve. He stood up, his tall frame casting a long, jagged shadow against the cinder-block walls, his fingers instinctively searching for a burner phone he'd tucked into his waistband. The vulnerability I had seen only moments ago was being buried under a layer of ice as he began to map out a counterstrike. His eyes, once fractured with confusion, were now fixed on the door with a lethal, singular focus. "I have 3 safe rooms in the city," he rasped, his voice regaining that low, predatory edge. "Naraya thinks she won, but she's forgotten who I am. I will find her, and I will burn down every bridge she ever walked across. By sunrise, there won't be enough left of that alliance to fill a grave." I stood my ground, the bowl of bloodied water resting on the table between us, a silent witness to the violence he was eager to return to. "And then what?" I asked, my voice calm but unwavering. He paused, his jaw tightening. "And then I regain my position. I show the world what happens to those who sell out Ulrich Vaughn." "You aren't regaining anything, Ulrich," I said, stepping into his line of sight, forcing him to look at me instead of the ghosts of his enemies. "Naraya didn't just betray you, she mirrored you. She used the same tools of deception, the same cold calculations, and the same disregard for life that you've used to build your throne." He turned toward me, a flash of anger sparking in his dark eyes. "You don't understand this world, Marlowe. It's kill or be killed. There is no middle ground." "There is the ground you're standing on right now," I countered, gesturing to the bandage on his arm and the wooden cross on the table. "If you go out there and execute her, you aren't winning. You're just feeding the cycle. You're proving that the only way to live is to be a monster. To kill her is to keep the very thing alive that tried to kill you tonight." I walked closer, my heart hammering against my ribs, but my gaze remained steady. "She is the reflection of the life you chose. If you want a different ending, you have to choose a different path. You can't find light by digging a deeper hole in the dark." Ulrich stared at me, his hand hovering over the phone. For a long minute, the only sound was the hum of the laundromat above us. The Mafia boss was caught in the mirror I held up to his soul, and for the first time, he looked truly terrified, not of the assassins outside, but of the person he would have to become to truly be free. The basement air, once sharp with the scent of fear and gunpowder, began to soften as the hum of the laundromat upstairs provided a steady, domestic rhythm. Ulrich sat back down in the plastic-covered chair, his body no longer a coiled spring of lethal intent, but a heavy frame of exhaustion. I moved to the small kitchenette in the corner, nothing more than a hot plate and a mini-fridge, and pulled out a simple loaf of bread and some cheese I'd kept for my own long shifts. I didn't offer him a banquet, and there were no crystal glasses or Tom Ford aesthetics to hide behind. I simply tore the bread into 2 rough pieces and handed one to him. For a moment, he stared at the offering as if it were an alien object. In his world, a meal was a theater of power, a place for poisoned wine, hidden recording devices, and the cold, predatory rhythm of business. He looked at the bread, then at my hands, which were steady and open. "Eat," I said softly, sitting across from him. "You can't find a new path on an empty heart." He took a bite, slowly at first, his eyes darting toward the basement door by habit, but as the silence of the room stretched out, something in his posture finally collapsed. He wasn't looking over his shoulder. For the first time in what looked like a lifetime, the Korean Mafia boss wasn't a target or a predator. He was just a man breaking bread with a stranger who expected nothing from him. The simplicity of the moment seemed to overwhelm him. It was a radical communion, a sacred pause in the middle of a war. There was no blood debt at this table, only the quiet warmth of shared survival. He chewed slowly, his gaze falling to the wooden cross resting between us, and I saw a single, fractured moment of peace wash over his face, a realization that there was a world beyond the gilded cage, one where safety wasn't bought with fear, but found in the simple act of being seen and fed. The transition from the basement's quiet sanctuary to the cold, clinical steel of the Vaughn Syndicate's headquarters felt like descending back into a lion's den. But the man walking beside me was no longer the beast he once was. Auric moved through the shadowed corridors with his jaw set, not in the predatory rhythm of a man seeking a kill, but with the heavy, somber gait of an executioner about to face his own past. We didn't sneak in through the service vents. We walked through the front doors, the golden light of the lobby feeling harsh and exposing. The boardroom was thick with the suffocating scent of Naraya's perfume and the metallic tension of men waiting for a crown to fall. Naraya sat at the head of the obsidian table, flanked by the captains who had already begun to divide Auric's empire like carrion. She looked up as we entered, her red lips parting in a gasp that was quickly replaced by a mask of cold, calculating defiance. Her thumb hovered over her phone, a reflex of the Judas who lived by the signal. But Auric didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he reached into his pocket and placed the smeared, ink-stained note and the small wooden cross onto the table. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of the light hitting things that had spent too long in the dark. Auric didn't shout or demand a blood debt. His voice was low, carrying a weight of conviction that made the seasoned killers in the room shift uncomfortably. He began to speak, not of revenge, but of the truth, exposing the secret meetings in the wine cellar, the bank accounts Naraya had bled dry, and the names of every man in the room who had traded their loyalty for a piece of his soul. One by one, he brought the hidden things into the light, laying them out like the broken pieces of a life he no longer wanted to lead. He looked at Naraya, not with the fire of a man betrayed, but with the profound, heartbreaking pity of someone who had finally seen his own reflection in her malice. The judgment wasn't found in a rain of bullets, but in the absolute exposure of their hollow ambitions. He was dismantling the empire not with fire, but by showing them that the throne was built on sand. For the first time, the Mafia boss wasn't ruling through domination. He was judging through the truth, standing in the center of the den as a man who had finally found a higher fortress. The tension in the boardroom was a physical weight, thick with the iron scent of cold sweat and the looming shadow of a violent conclusion. Auric stood over Naraya, his tattooed hand finally reaching for the sleek, silver pistol tucked into the back of his waistband, a relic of the man he had been. The captains held their breath, their fingers twitching near their own weapons, expecting the red splash of a traditional mafia ending. Naraya looked up at him, her glamorous curls disheveled, her eyes wide with a terror that finally matched the darkness of her soul. She braced herself, waiting for the blood debt she knew she deserved. I stood behind Auric, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, but I didn't reach for his arm or shout a plea. Instead, I closed my eyes and offered a silent prayer, a desperate intercession for the soul of the man who stood on the precipice of his old life. I prayed for a strength that didn't come from a barrel of a gun, but from the radical mercy I had tried to show him in the basement's shadows. Auric's knuckles were white as he gripped the cold steel. He looked at the weapon, then flicked his gaze to me, catching the silent, steady light in my eyes. He looked back at Naraya, the woman who had sold him out to the glass-shattering bullets of assassins. The room was a vacuum of silence, a ticking clock moment where the cycle of revenge threatened to restart. Then, Auric did the unthinkable. With a slow, deliberate motion, he didn't raise the gun. He placed it on the obsidian table and slid it across the polished surface toward Naraya. It stopped just short of her trembling hands. The captains gasped, a collective sound of disbelief echoing through the hall of power. I am not the man who needs your blood to feel whole, Auric rasped, his voice carrying a resonant, newfound authority that silenced the room. The life you want, the throne, the empire, the fear, it's yours. But you'll find it's a cage with no key. He leaned over the table, his face inches from hers, but there was no predatory rhythm left in his movements. There is a car waiting downstairs. It won't take you to a hitman, but to the airport. Go. Find a way to live that doesn't involve burying people you claim to love. He offered her a way out instead of an end, a radical display of mercy that dismantled the mafia boss persona entirely. Naraya stared at the gun, then at the man who had just handed her her life, her expression fracturing into a profound, agonizing confusion. Auric turned his back on her, the ultimate act of trust and surrender, and walked toward me. He was no longer the boss. He was a man who had dropped the blade to pick up his own soul. The heavy obsidian doors of the Vaughn Syndicate slammed shut for the last time, the echo ringing through the marble halls like a final amen. Auric didn't look back at the throne he had vacated, or the empire that was already beginning to fracture without its predator. He walked out into the crisp, soul morning, the neon lights of the city fading under the soft, persistent glow of a rising sun. Beside him, I felt the weight of the night finally lift, replaced by a quiet, humbler kind of hope. 6 months later, the scent of industrial soap and damp concrete was gone, replaced by the smell of fresh pine and floor wax. The basement under the laundromat had been traded for a sprawling, sun-drenched space in the heart of the neighborhood. Auric stood in the center of the new community center, his Tom Ford suit replaced by a simple dark sweater, his tattooed hands no longer drumming a predatory rhythm, but holding a stack of lunch trays. He had dismantled his empire piece by piece, liquidating the assets of a life built on fear to fund a future built on service. The Korean Mafia boss had become a phantom of the past. In his place was a man who knew the names of the kids in the after-school program and the elderly neighbors who came in for a warm meal. He used his resources not to command, but to provide, trading the isolation of power for the messiness of community. I watched him as he sat down at a long wooden table, not at the head, but in the middle of the noise and the laughter. He broke bread with a group of teenagers, the same way we had broken bread in the shadows of that basement safe house. There were no hidden recording devices here, no ticking clock, and no glass-shattering bullets. As he looked up and caught my eye, the marble of his face was gone, replaced by a piece that his money could never have bought. He wasn't a boss anymore, and he wasn't just a survivor. He was a brother. He had finally realized that the greatest among us isn't the one who sits on a throne of stolen lights, but the one who picks up a towel and serves. The delivery was finally complete. The gift hadn't ended his life. It had given him a new one.